is a very good run. Congratulations to you, Ellen, considering all you've been through during those 19 years, including the workplace conditions, which, by the way, I believe she's leaving because the workplace conditions.
What if the most kind woman in daytime television wasn't actually kind at all? For 19 years, Ellen DeGeneres built something no one in Hollywood could ignore, a global empire wrapped in two simple words: be kind. She danced on stage, gave away cars, surprised families, and turned her show into a symbol of positivity that millions trusted without question. But behind that carefully polished image, something very different was allegedly happening off camera. Former employees have described a workplace that didn't feel like laughter and joy, but instead felt like pressure, silence, and fear. A place where the energy changed the moment the cameras stopped rolling. And now, the conversation has shifted again because Wendy Williams has stepped forward, adding fuel to claims that there was more going on behind the scenes than the public ever realized. Not just one complaint, not just isolated stories, but what some are calling a pattern of control hidden beneath a perfect image. So now the question hits harder than ever. Was Ellen DeGeneres truly the queen of kindness the world believed her to be? Or was that image carefully built, rehearsed, and protected for nearly 2 decades? Because if even a fraction of these claims are true, then the most dangerous thing about The Ellen Show wasn't what you saw on screen, it was what you were never supposed to see at all. And once you start looking at her legacy through that lens, the entire story begins to feel different. The smile, the applause, the dancing audience. All of it starts to raise one unsettling question: how much of it was real, and how much of it was performance? How much of it was real, and how much of it was performance? That question doesn't just hang in the air, it lingers over everything that came after. Because according to former employees, the version of Ellen the world saw on television was only one half of the story. A carefully constructed half. Bright lights, scripted humor, controlled surprises, and perfectly timed emotional moments designed to create one consistent feeling in the audience: trust. But trust is fragile when it depends on perfection. Inside Hollywood, perfection is rarely accidental. It is built, it is managed, and most importantly, it is protected. And that's where the story begins to shift. Wendy Williams, known for her unfiltered commentary and willingness to speak on uncomfortable industry dynamics, has long hinted that what the public sees on camera is often only the front stage of a much larger machine. According to her perspective, daytime television is not just entertainment, it is branding at its highest level. And branding, when it becomes powerful enough, starts to demand control over every detail. In Ellen's case, that control allegedly extended far beyond lighting, scripts, and production cues. Former staff members have described an environment where hierarchy was absolute, where even small mistakes could create tension, where the atmosphere reportedly changed depending on who was in the room and who wasn't. To outsiders, that might sound like standard high-pressure television production. But critics argue there's a difference between pressure and culture. Pressure is occasional. Culture is constant. And this is where the allegations become more controversial. Because what made Ellen's show unique was not just its success, it was its identity. Be kind wasn't just a slogan, it was the foundation of an entire public image. It suggested warmth, safety, and emotional generosity. It told audiences that what they were watching wasn't just a talk show, but a space of positivity in an often harsh world. So when whispers of a different reality began to surface, they didn't just challenge a workplace, they challenged an entire belief system. One former staffer described it like living in 2 different worlds at once, the world on camera and the world behind it. On camera, everything was laughter, dancing, and emotional storytelling. Off camera, they described tension, silence, and a strict expectation of professionalism that left little room for error. In entertainment, that contrast is not unusual. Many productions operate with strict standards. But what made this situation different, according to critics, was the gap between the message and the environment. Because when a brand is built entirely on kindness, any suggestion of the opposite becomes amplified. And that is exactly what happened. Over time, online discussions began to grow. Former employees shared experiences anonymously. Media outlets picked up fragments of those stories. Social media amplified them further, turning isolated claims into a broader conversation about workplace culture in Hollywood. Because Ellen's brand was not built on intensity or discipline. It was built on kindness. And that is what made every allegation feel heavier than it might in another context. Wendy Williams, when discussing the situation, didn't frame it as a simple workplace disagreement. Instead, she pointed toward something broader, how power and image can become intertwined in entertainment until separating truth from branding becomes nearly impossible. According to that perspective, the problem isn't just what happens behind the scenes, it's how long it can remain hidden when the public narrative is strong enough. And Ellen's narrative was one of the strongest in daytime television history. That's why the shift was so significant. Because once doubt enters a story like this, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads outward, connecting unrelated moments into a single perceived pattern. A tense interview here, a staff rumor there. A social media post from years ago suddenly gets reinterpreted. Even neutral moments begin to feel symbolic. A simple facial expression becomes a topic of debate. A short response in an interview becomes a headline. Silence from former staff becomes interpreted as meaning more than it originally did. And slowly, the conversation stops being about isolated claims and becomes about perception itself. Was Ellen kind? Was she strict? Was she misunderstood? Was she carefully managing an image? Or was she simply a high-profile host running a massive production under constant pressure? Different audiences arrived at completely different conclusions using the same set of public information. And that is where the story becomes psychologically powerful. Because it stops being about facts alone, it becomes about interpretation. Meanwhile, the industry response remained mostly careful. In Hollywood, public statements around high-profile figures are often measured, especially when legal issues or reputational concerns are involved. Many voices chose not to engage directly, which only added another layer of speculation for the public. Silence in entertainment is never neutral. It is always read as something. And in this case, silence became part of the story itself. As online discussions grew, clips of Wendy Williams resurfaced again and again. Her commentary was often direct, sometimes controversial, but always framed around questioning the gap between public image and private behavior in celebrity culture. She didn't present evidence as final judgment. Instead, she raised questions about systems, how they operate, how they protect reputations, and how audiences often only see the surface layer of what is actually happening behind production walls. That framing is what kept the debate alive, because it shifted focus from one individual to an entire structure. And once you start looking at structures instead of single events, the conversation changes completely. Now it is no longer just what happened. It becomes, how does this industry function in general? And that question opens far more doors than it closes. At the same time, supporters of Ellen continued to emphasize her long career, charitable contributions, and the millions of viewers who experienced genuine joy through her platform. They argue that reducing decades of work to workplace allegations ignores the broader impact of her career. They also point out that large productions require strict coordination and that misunderstandings in high-pressure environments are not uncommon. But critics respond with a different concern: impact versus experience. Even if millions experienced positivity on screen, what about the people working behind it? Does audience experience override workplace experience? Or should both be weighed equally? These questions don't have simple answers. And that is why the debate continues without resolution. Meanwhile, the cultural impact of the controversy grew beyond Ellen herself. It began feeding into a larger conversation about Hollywood workplaces in general, how talk shows operate, how celebrity brands are maintained, and how much of what audiences see is curated versus authentic. Because once one major figure is questioned, attention often shifts outward. Other shows, other hosts, other production environments. Everything becomes part of a broader investigation in the public mind. And that is what makes this situation so persistent. It is not contained. It expands. It evolves. It reinterprets the past while reacting to the present. And even without new confirmed revelations, the narrative continues to grow simply because people are still trying to reconcile two conflicting versions of the same story. One version is built on decades of televised kindness, emotional moments, and public generosity. The other is built on claims, interpretations, and behind-the-scenes accounts that challenge that image. Both exist simultaneously in public discourse, and neither has fully erased the other. So the question remains still unresolved, still debated. When the cameras turn off and the audience is gone, what version of the story is real? And more importantly, how much of what we believe about celebrity culture is actually just carefully maintained illusion? How much of what we believe about celebrity culture is actually just carefully maintained illusion? That question doesn't just stay in the background anymore. It becomes the center of everything. Because once an audience starts questioning the boundary between performance and reality, every detail of the past starts to feel uncertain. And in this case, that uncertainty doesn't fade, it deepens. As the conversation around Ellen DeGeneres continued to circulate online, the narrative stopped being just about one show or one personality. It turned into something bigger, a reflection of how modern fame itself is constructed, consumed, and defended. In entertainment, perception is power. And perception is built over time, repetition, and emotional consistency. Ellen's brand of kindness was not just a slogan, it was a long-term identity strategy. Every episode reinforced it. Every segment reinforced it. Every viral clip reinforced it. But when a single consistent narrative lasts long enough, it becomes almost immune to criticism. Not because criticism doesn't exist, but because it gets filtered through disbelief. How could someone so kind be involved in something negative? That question became the psychological shield around the entire image. And that is exactly why the allegations, discussions, and commentary created such a strong reaction when they emerged. They didn't just challenge behavior, they challenged belief. Wendy Williams' commentary added fuel to this broader conversation by framing it as a structural issue in entertainment. In her perspective, Hollywood doesn't just create stars, it creates systems around them. Systems designed to maintain control, consistency, and profitability. And within those systems, image becomes everything. Not behavior, not perception behind closed doors, but image. Because image is what sells. And in Ellen's case, that image had become globally recognizable. But as more voices entered the discussion, a pattern began to form in public discourse, not necessarily a confirmed pattern of wrongdoing, but a pattern of reinterpretation. Old interviews were revisited. Staff claims were reread. Past controversies were placed side by side with newer commentary. And every piece of content became part of a larger puzzle that audiences tried to assemble on their own. However, what made this situation unique was that the puzzle never had complete pieces, only fragments. And fragments always lead to interpretation. Some saw a strict workplace environment typical of high-level production. Others saw emotional inconsistency between public messaging and internal reports. And many simply felt caught between two competing narratives with no definitive resolution. That tension is what kept the conversation alive. Because unresolved stories are the ones that linger longest in public memory. At the same time, it's important to recognize how entertainment systems function at scale. A major talk show is not a small workplace. It is a high-pressure production involving hundreds of staff, global audiences, celebrity guests, and strict broadcasting schedules. Mistakes are expensive. Timing is critical. Reputation is everything. In such environments, tension is not unusual. But perception determines legacy. And legacy, once formed, is difficult to reshape. As discussions continued, some voices emphasized that no formal legal case has defined Ellen in the way online narratives sometimes suggest. Others pointed out that public opinion often moves faster than verified information, especially in the age of social media, where clips circulate without full context. This gap between perception and verification is where modern controversies live. And this case is no exception. Over time, the discussion expanded beyond Ellen herself and became a broader commentary on celebrity culture. on how audiences build emotional connections with media figures, on how branding can shape moral expectations, and on how difficult it is to separate personality from performance when both are presented in the same package for decades. Because when someone becomes a symbol, like Ellen did with Be Kind, that symbol begins to carry expectations far beyond any single human behavior. And when reality doesn't perfectly align with that symbol, the disconnect becomes emotionally powerful for audiences. That emotional disconnect is what fuels ongoing debate. Supporters continue to highlight the positive cultural impact of Ellen's career, the generosity shown on air, the millions of viewers who felt seen or uplifted, and the platform she built over nearly 2 decades that shaped daytime television globally. Critics, however, continue to focus on the alleged gap between public image and private experience, arguing that influence carries responsibility not just on screen, but behind it as well. Both perspectives exist simultaneously. Neither fully cancels the other. And that is why the story remains open-ended in public discourse. Because at its core, this is not just a story about one individual, it is a story about how modern fame is consumed. Audiences no longer receive celebrity narratives passively. They dissect them. They reanalyze them. They reconstruct them based on fragments of information, emotional reactions, and evolving cultural expectations. And once that process begins, stories rarely end, they evolve. So where does that leave everything? It leaves us in a space where certainty is rare, but curiosity is constant. Where perception competes with reality. And where legacy is not just written by achievements, but by interpretation. In the end, the most powerful takeaway from this entire discussion is not a conclusion about guilt or innocence. It is a reflection on how easily public perception can shift when the story behind the story begins to surface. Because whether someone sees Ellen as a symbol of kindness or a subject of controversy, one thing is undeniable. Her story changed the way audiences look at the gap between what is shown and what might exist beyond the frame. And maybe that is the real impact of everything that followed. Not the answers, but the questions that remain. And those questions are still being asked today. And now I want to hear from you. Because after everything you've just seen, the claims, the interviews, the behind-the-scenes allegations, and the conflicting narratives, this story doesn't really end here. It continues in the way people interpret it. Do you believe Ellen's image was exactly what it appeared to be on screen, a genuine reflection of kindness and positivity? Or do you think there was a completely different reality happening behind the cameras that the public was never meant to see? This is where your opinion actually matters. Because stories like this don't stay alive because of headlines, they stay alive because people keep questioning them, analyzing them, and debating what's real and what's performance. So drop your thoughts in the comments. Backhand index pointing right, was this just Hollywood pressure and misunderstanding? Backhand index pointing right, or was there something deeper happening behind the scenes that explains all the whispers, exits, and controversy? And if you've made it this far into the video, you already know this isn't just about one celebrity or one show. It's about how entertainment, power, and perception all mix together in ways most people never think about. If you found this breakdown insightful, don't forget to like the video. It helps push more content like this to people who are interested in the truth behind the spotlight. And make sure you subscribe, because this is just one chapter in a much bigger conversation about fame, influence, and what really happens when the cameras stop rolling. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive, because the next story might be even more controversial than this one. Until then, stay aware, stay curious, and question everything you see on screen.